Welcome back to my trek through the first volume of Mushoku Tensei Jobless Reincarnation. I am starting to get fears about how many parts this series is going to take for me to get through all this stuff, because there's just so much content in here that I love diving into. In my first video, I was only able to get through the first 2 chapters of my thoughts on it, but I guess, again, that's really how much content is in there, what's in there to really discuss, and unfortunately what kind of gets lost when you get to pacing an actual anime adaptation. Very quickly, I want to make sure to warn people that are just jumping straight into this video. I am doing it from perspective of somebody that's watched the first season of the anime adaptation and diving into the differences and the emphases that are given in the actual novel itself. So with that said, let's see how many chapters I can get through this time. Following our brief look into Lilia the maid, we jump right back into Rudy. Very briefly, and I'm not sure if it was covered in the anime, but it does talk about how Rudy had 3 books that were read to him by Paul, and that included a fairy tale book about Perugus, which he, at this point, believes is a fairy tale. Like, oh, this is something that they just tell that's completely fake, but of course what we find out eventually is that this is something that is actually in this world. A book about a summoner and his companions that battle demons and save the world, and the 3 swordsmen and the labyrinth. Jumping from here, we start to have Rudy start to get into magic itself, which I think pretty much everything was covered in the anime adaptation, so I'm not going to go through all that stuff, but I did find it more interesting to get a perspective of his inner thoughts, really describing the sensations that he has when he casts a spell or does an incantation, and how that transfers to incantationless spells. And how that gets into more detail later on in this first volume, and how much it kind of becomes a pivotal reason why he's not able to do certain spells. Things that are outside of science and his knowledge of the world itself, it becomes something he can't fabricate, I guess. Additionally, I'm not sure how well the anime itself covered incantations versus magic circles. This is something that he talked about a little bit in the idea that if you do certain spells, they may be so long of an incantation that using magic circles was actually better. In that in some cases, you could essentially use both, which was kind of curious. But jumping forward to the point in which he finally blows up the wall in the house. I found this interesting because while you had Paul arrive and Zenith arrives, it gives a lot of emphasis on Rudy's mindset at this point and how he wants to handle his life in this new world. Again, this is something that I'm probably going to hit on way too much, but with having so much inner dialogue for Rudy, it does give you a better picture on exactly where his mind is. And I know this is a big criticism that a lot of people had with the anime adaptation. They just assumed Rudy's a terrible person, he's always perving out, he's always thinking about pervy things, he's a terrible person. Yes, we all acknowledge that. Rudy is a terrible person. But I do love, differently than you got from the anime, was how much emphasis, just I'm getting with these first few chapters, is putting on how Rudy thinks. How he really does want a new life. How everything he did wrong in his previous life, he wants to do differently now. And this is another case in this scenario where he blew up this wall. He immediately wants to apologize. He immediately jumps into the mode that I did something wrong and I need to make sure that they know that I'm not going to lie to them. He's gained their trust at this point. What happened here? Tell them. Don't make excuses. Don't hide from it. Tell them. The fact that he's willing at this point to be honest is a huge change for him, and he wants to do differently in this life. Of course, following this, we have the introduction of Roxy. Now that he has proven that he has the aptitude for magic, Zenith immediately wants him to have a tutor, so they hire Roxy. And this leads us to the first lesson from Roxy, which I did find a few things in here very interesting. One, which I had to confirm with somebody. I'm like, did I read this wrong? Is it later on? No, yes, this is the first case that I've noted that the anime had something that the novel didn't. Well, granted, earlier I mentioned in the previous video that the anime mentioned the fact that the 2 children were missing that he was trying to save, and only the first one was in the ambulance. So I guess that technically is the first case, but yes, one of my favorite scenes in the anime wasn't even in the novel. Which was when Rudy first does his cast after Roxy does. In the anime, Rudy begins casting a spell and a wind gust comes up, upskirts Roxy, and Rudy doesn't finish his incantation and the spell still goes off. Now, yes, it's funny because it's ecchi, Roxy's skirt flies up. That wasn't even in the novel. Instead, he just basically flubs the spell. And it still goes off, which indicates to Roxy that he's able to do incantationless spells. Interesting difference there. Not that it's a bad thing. I mean, obviously, Scared Roxy's fine with me, but it was very interesting to have that. Additionally, during this conversation, during this first training session, we do get into the complexity of the spells itself. Again, something I'm not sure was covered in the anime is the emphasis that creating spells of bigger or smaller sizes actually consumes pretty much more mana either way. You would assume that because you create a spell, a water ball that's smaller, it would take less mana, but he's pointing out at this particular point that it doesn't change anything. If you create something bigger, it's going to cost more mana. If you create something smaller, it's going to cost more mana, which is very odd. Now, my thought process there is it because it's more condensed, but it's still the same amount of mana? That's going to be the question mark. But it just seems like it's indicating that just manipulating something that is base model consumes more mana. You're essentially instructing it to become smaller, thus it's consuming more mana either way. You're adding to the spell an additional formula to change its size. Following this, we get quite a bit of insights into the origin of magic itself. I think a bit of this was covered in the anime, but not quite to this extent. Roxy says that it's known that the High Elves was the origin of magic. During the time of this long-running conflict that was happening in the past of chaos and war, the High Elves essentially used the spirits of the forest to create magic. And after this, humans basically adopted the concept, and they tried to mold it in their own way, and in a sense have evolved it over time. She talks about the fact that humans are really good at innovation in this world, and so they took it and they basically evolved it in their own way. And of course, this was also in conversation about utility outside of combat itself. Why is all magic so focused on combat? Is there anything that does things outside of that? Which Rudy has questioned before, but here we're really just kind of hitting on the idea that why? Because there's so many tools at hand that can do the same job, why go out of your way to waste mana and time casting a spell when you can just get a lantern, per se? And of course, this did get into the history of the war itself, that the human-demon war had been going on for 7,000 years, and they were at war all the way up until about 400 years ago, which I think is probably the point where Pitagus was involved. Bouncing off this conversation, Rudy did end up asking Roxy about summoning magic specifically. He's really curious, like, when you're going to teach me summoning magic, but she's like, no, I can't teach you because I've never done it myself. But summoning itself can bring about both fiends and spirits themselves. We don't really get a context exactly what all's involved there because Roxy's not really knowledgeable on it. But this does get into a discussion around fiends and monster, which I think was covered a little bit in the anime, but I'm not really sure. But there was a lot of emphasis in these first few chapters on fiends and monsters, how they come to be, the threat of them in the forest itself, and Rudy's perspective on those. When asked about the difference between the fiends and monsters to Roxy, it gets into explanation that monsters are essentially what happens when you see a mutation in normal animals. When you get into fiends themselves, this is whenever monsters have given time to essentially gather numbers, become their own species, and gain intelligence. But she does note there's times when these fiends become so savage and so brutal over the generations that they revert back to becoming monsters. Following this, I had a moment of a laugh. I had to post this in our Discord. At some point, they were talking about essentially technical magic. At some point, they were discussing creating rain. And he felt like this was a useless spell. Like, this is an advanced spell, but it's so useless because why would I need to create rain? And it gets into the fact that Roxy was essentially using this in order to gain favor of the people. Because the crops are drying up, she would create rain and it would obviously, nurture the plants, water the crops. But the reason why this made me laugh so much is because, again, if you get into the later parts of the first season of the anime adaptation, we obviously see Rudy use this to put out fires in this one village. So it's like one of those things where, was the writer already foreshadowing way back here? It's kind of funny. But yeah, they did spend quite a bit of time talking about Roxy and everything that she kind of did for the village and helping them out. But additionally talking about her doing this, not because she wanted to be thanked. Rudy was like, you're just doing it. I knew you were a good person. You're just helping them out. She's like, no, I'm doing it to be compensated. And this kind of gets in a little bit of his mindset of his previous life, saying, well, this is kind of different. This world's different than Japan, where we would just do things because you wanted to get thanks or you wanted to help people out. Here, it's normal to do things for compensation. It's not a bad thing. And I found this very interesting because towards the later parts of it, you do have Roxy really trying to instill upon Rudy to not rely on his magic. Because if you think that you can do anything, eventually you'll run into something that you can't do, and then you're going to be in trouble. And this is kind of obviously emphasizing heavily about Roxy having experience because of this, which I'm hoping later on in the series and the anime will eventually get into, because it's been heavily implied Roxy's previous adventure group that she used to be a part of. But yes, this leads into the exam, which was really interesting because I felt like a lot of things were different here. In the travels with Rudy getting on the horse with Roxy and them leaving the home, yes, all that stuff was pretty much covered word for word. The differences that I really did feel like in the anime, they give a lot of emphasis on once Rudy realized that everybody was looking at Roxy, he started to greet everybody along with Roxy, and I didn't really see that in the novel series. He did become comfortable and realized that he was safe, but at the same time, it was more emphasized in the anime that he was open and talking to people. This is something that really didn't happen in the novel series until later on when he first starts leaving his home again, after Roxy had left. But additionally, in this segment, we did get an insight into Paul and what his whole role was in the actual village. He was assigned to this village to protect it and to resolve disputes and do basically government things. He's almost like a sheriff, I guess is the best way to put it. He's a knight that was assigned to this village to protect it and to resolve conflicts. Which again, is something I didn't really get too much in the anime. I know that people did kind of try to correct me when I was doing my anime impressions, but that was something that was a little bit off for me. But the exam itself was quite different as well. And this is a really odd change in my perspective. This is something that I guess they were just trying to get through this whole content and really just give it a fantastical ending, but very interesting. When they arrive at the place they're going to cast a spell, obviously we indicate that we have to go out in the middle of nowhere, we're going to damage crops, all that stuff is the same. They tie up the horse, and then they begin to start the exam. Interestingly enough, the exam in the novel, Roxy states that I'm going to only perform the beginning of this, just so you know what I'm doing. And then you're going to perform the same spell, so pay attention. But the weird thing is in the novel, she wanted him to perform it and keep it going for an hour. I had to go back and check because in the anime, she literally just says, I'm going to do it once because that's all I have mana for. And then you're going to do it. Anyways, she performs it and yes, strikes the horse with the lightning, goes over and heals it. Again, another weird thing in the anime is that when it strikes the horse, she panics, but then she says, what do I do? And Rudy says to heal it. But in the novel, she panics, immediately runs over and heals it. Rudy doesn't really say anything there. Now, I want to make it clear, I'm not nitpicking here and saying that the anime is terrible. I know that it's just one of those changes that, yes, if you think about it, kind of changes the context of things. In the anime, it really kind of just puts a lot of emphasis on Roxy panicking here. Whereas in the novel series, yes, she's panicking, but she knows what she needs to do. But moving on from this is when Rudy himself has to perform the spell and, like I said, perform it for a full hour. He does create the spell itself, but he also starts thinking on himself, how am I going to keep this thing going? And his mind immediately goes into science itself. Now, I'm assuming there's probably something here in context of the world itself. What Roxy would have believed he would have to do in order to keep the spell going for an hour? Is there something that he would have to add to the incantation? I believe she mentioned something to the effect that he has to keep filling it with magic in order to keep it going. But instead, Rudy, thinking from a scientific, modern time perspective, he goes into, well, I know how clouds work. I know, the temperatures that feed a storm itself works. So he just basically creates a draft of different temperatures to keep feeling the storm itself. And because he does this, which is completely opposite to what Roxy would believe he'd have to do. I mean, from Roxy's perspective, he's going to go out there, he's going to create the spell, and he's going to sit there and keep channeling to keep it going. But again, because Rudy uses science to create this temperature draft, he can just do that and leave it be. Like, it's feeling it. I've created science to fuel the storm. So he ends up going over to Roxy and going, all right, it's going. Do I really need to stand here for an hour? She's like, wait, what are you doing? Wait, it's still going. And that shocks her, and enough that it shocks her that she drops the shield around this horse. But her seeing that, she realizes he's already put everything into effect. The fact that he manipulated things the way that he did was enough to pass. She ended up changing the requirements to pass the exam from keep this fueled for an hour to, well, you manipulate it so well that it's fueled, you pass. Following the exam, there's a lot of emphasis put on just how much this meant to Rudy. One being that this is the first time he's accomplished something in his new life. Again, this first volume seems to put so much heavy emphasis on this is what I once was, and this is who I am now. This is my chance to do things differently, and the exam, becoming a water saint, was his first big milestone. It's the first time I've accomplished something. I've gained something in this new life that I'm definitely going to do something different in, that I'm going to do things right in. And of course, the other side of this whole thing of appreciation is in Roxy herself, bringing him out of that shell that he once was. This is something that was emphasized pretty well in the anime itself, but I might be overblowing this. It felt like several pages was just how much Rudy appreciates Roxy for bringing him out of that location, to getting him on this horse and going out there and showing that this whole world's not looking at him. Of course, he does acknowledge that Roxy didn't do this intentionally. He's like, I know she didn't just set out to go, I need to bring him out of the shell, but he still appreciates that from her. He still likes the fact that this girl took me out of my shell and showed me the outside world. Helped me break my shut-in nature, which is something that I loved in the anime, and I loved reading through it again with the novel. It's just, this is a concept that I think is just, it's so simple, but it's so impactful. That idea that because of something being so important to you might seem very little to other people. All I did was put him on a horse and rode him out there. But to him, this was life-changing. But anyway, that's it for this video. That is chapters 3 through 6. I swear to you, we're gonna get through this first volume. I think it's going to turn into 4 videos per volume at least, but I hope you guys enjoyed this video. As always, if you did, make sure to hit that like button down below. Additionally, if you can, because this is a new video series for me, I would love to hear you guys' feedback. What are you liking about this video series? Is there things that you'd like to have changed? Did I miss something? Definitely let me know. Please give me your feedback, because I'm going to be covering a lot of this series, so I'd love to hear from you guys. Additionally, if you've not already, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you get all my videos, including the ones that I'm doing coverage on the Mushoku Tensei Jobless Reincarnation novel series. Additionally, I do first impressions of the current anime season, as well as reviews, top lists, news bits. If it's anime, it's pretty much here. If you'd like to support us more, we have a Patreon link and a tips link in the description below. We definitely appreciate everybody that supports us, and y'all take care.